Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Farah Jasmine Griffin, Chair of the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department here at Columbia, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's discussion of my colleague Frank Guridy's new book, The Sports Revolution: How Texas Changed the Culture of American Athletics. We're very excited to be gathered here to celebrate this publication. Frank will open up with a few remarks, and he'll be followed by our panelists, whom I'll introduce now. And then we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. So if you have questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A function of the chat. Professor Frank Guridy specializes in sport history, urban history, and the history of the African diaspora in the Americas. His first book, Forging Diaspora: Afro-Cubans and African Americans in the World of Empire and Jim Crow, was published in 2010 and won a number of important prizes. He's also an award-winning teacher, receiving the Regents Outstanding Teaching Award from the University of Texas at Austin, and most recently here at Columbia, the Mark Van Doren Award for Teaching. His next book project, Assembly in the Fragmented City, a history of the a history of the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, examines the iconic structure's impact on the emergence of Los Angeles as a global city. But before that, we have to talk about this one, the sports revolution. Our panelists who will be responding to Frank's book is Amy Bass, a professor of sports studies at Manhattanville College, where her interests focus on sport, culture, and politics. And she's also chair of the Division of Social Science and Communication. Her first book, Not the Triumph, but the Struggle, the 1968 Olympic Games and the Making of the Black Athlete, is considered a standard bearer for those interested in studying sport from a cultural perspective. Her follow-up, In the Game, solidified that reputation. She will be followed by Josef Sorett, a professor of religion and African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia, where he is also chair of the Department of Religion and directs the Center on African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice. Josef is an interdisciplinary scholar of religion and race in the Americas. His first book, Spirit in the Dark: A Religious History of Racial Aesthetics, was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. It illuminates how religion has figured in debates about Black art and culture across the 20th century. A second book, The Holy, Holy Black: The Ironies of an American Secular, is also forthcoming from Oxford University Press. And our last speaker, Samuel G. Freedman, is an award-winning author, columnist, and professor. He's a columnist for the New York Times, as well as a professor at the Columbia University School of Journalism. He's the author of 7 acclaimed books, including Breaking the Line: The Season in Black College Football That Transformed the Game and Changed the Course of Civil Rights. So please welcome our speakers, and I'll turn it over to Frank, who will give an introduction to this new book.
Thank you, Professor Griffin, Farah, and thank you, my fellow panelists. I'm going to thank them a lot today because I really appreciate their time and energy. But I want to thank ISERP, the Heyman Center, and also I also want to thank Harlow Wang for handling the logistics for this event and for figuring out how to get all of us busy people into the same virtual space. That's an achievement in and of itself. So thank you, Harlow, for that. And again, I want to thank Farah, Josef, Amy, and Sam for devoting their valuable time and energy to reading my book and for doing the intellectual labor, because that is work, of commenting on my book today. I am excited to be here with you all virtually, but I have to say I'm still processing the Derek Chauvin verdict. And really, I'm still processing everything that has transpired after Chauvin murdered George Floyd last year, almost a year ago. I'm relieved at the guilty verdict, and yet I'm still feeling angry about the ongoing brutalization of Black people by the police, right? So this is feeling a sense of relief, but also ongoing despair and anger that I think a number of us are feeling today. And it is absolutely true that the ongoing struggles for social justice, the movement for Black lives, the Me Too movement, the struggle to remove Donald Trump from the White House, the struggle against white supremacist politics, all of these struggles of the past several years, right, almost a decade now, influenced the production of this book, undoubtedly. right? So what is the sports revolution? How Texas changed the culture of American athletics about? In a nutshell, this book tells the story of the impact of the civil rights and second wave feminist movements on the world of big time professional and collegiate sports in the United States from the 1960s to the 1980s. The setting is the state of Texas, a place that I lived and worked for 11 years, and I still have deep connections to. Texas, that region that had a profound impact on the expansion of professional and collegiate sports in the United States in this period. But Texas merits attention not only because of the enormous influence of the state's sports entrepreneurs and athletes, but also because it serves as a fascinating case study in its own right. The book illustrates how an unlikely alliance among sports entrepreneurs and athletes from marginalized backgrounds changed American sporting culture. It shows how Texas sports entrepreneurs transformed US sports spectating by building new facilities like the Houston Astrodome, the United States' first dome sports stadium that combines suburban style comfort while catering to a cross-class and cross-racial constituency. It shows how far-sighted white team owners, college athletic administrators, and coaches teamed up with aspiring Black athletes to usher in the racial integration of professional and intercollegiate sports in the state. It also chronicles how Texas became a site of gender transformations by illustrating how feminist-inspired sports entrepreneurs and athletes used Philip Morris tobacco money to launch the first women's professional tennis circuit in Houston in 1970. At the same time, it's at that time that the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders provoked intense debates about the meaning of womanhood in the age of the sexual revolution and second wave feminism. The book tracks the expansion of professional sports into the state, right? It tells the story of how a mayor of an emerging suburb in Dallas-Fort Worth lured Major League Baseball from Washington, D.C., while also documenting how Mexican-American fans helped spark a revival of professional basketball in San Antonio. The book ends in the 1980s, and it argues that the social achievements that were catalyzed by these alliances were undone by the very same forces of commercialization that set them in motion. Tracking these changes on the field, in the stands, and in the television truck, the book illustrates how, for better and for worse, Texas was at the center of America's expanding political, economic, and emotional investments in sport in this period. At the same time, the book really is an interpretive history of the 1960s and 70s in the United States, the period when the gains of the Black freedom and feminist movements could be vividly seen in the world of sports. During these years, marginalized athletes of color and women athletes entered realms of the athletic labor force where they had been previously excluded. Yet they did so under the careful supervision of white male team owners, managers, and coaches. By analyzing these dynamics on the field and off the field, the book draws together traditions of sports writing, along with critical sports studies with the insights of intersectional feminist ethics studies. The book, is written for a general interest reader and for scholars, but it aims to make an intervention in the historiography of sports and the social movements of the 1960s and 70s. Whereas most sports books treat the Black athlete, unquote, quote unquote, women in sports, quote unquote, and unmarked white sportsmen separately, typically, this book tries to put them in the same analytic field, highlighting both the racial and gender implications of the sports revolution within a larger context of deepening capitalist social relations. The book asks readers to scrutinize the terms of inclusion that were established in this period, to highlight the ways that sports performance catalyzed and represented freedom and equality, while also underscoring the clear limits of that transformation. The book really took shape when I was doing public history work, actually, when I was the director of the John L. Warfield Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, almost a decade ago. It was during those years that I encountered a dedicated group of Black sports enthusiasts who were firmly committed to preserving the history of African Americans in athletics during the era of Jim Crow segregation and beyond. Historian Michael Hurd's book, Thursday Night Lights, compellingly demonstrates the history of Black athletics in Jim Crow Texas. In this history, I saw how Black sporting institutions, like Black churches and Black schools, provided spaces of community formation that helped African Americans survive Jim Crow, as it did for the Mexican American population in the state as well. Sport also provided a vehicle of upper mobility for working class white Texans, I should say. Right. These realizations doing this public history work, actually, along with my evolving interest in sports history, led me to jump at the chance to write a history of sport and society in Texas, that region that was shaped by the legacy of colonization, slavery, and Jim Crow segregation, but had been undeniably transformed by the influx of Black and marginalized people into previously prohibited spaces. The enormous popularity of sports in Texas, people know this nationwide, that sports is a Texas obsession, including its history of cross-racial interaction and entrepreneurial innovation, seem to be topics worthy of exploration. And these suspicions were borne out by the research I did in various archives throughout the state. With this book, I feel like I've been able to harmonize my longstanding interest in sport performance with my own social justice commitments to join the work of historians who aim to write the history of the United States from the perspective of the dispossessed, the marginalized, and the silenced. Before I end, I just figure I'd read to you just a little excerpt from the book, really just the beginning of chapter 8, to get a sense of how I try to bring these things together. There's a lot of play-by-play sports analysis in this book. I won't read that stuff to you because that takes too long to get into. This chapter is called Slammin' and Jammin' in Houston. And it's a chapter on the University of Houston's athletic program, the basketball program in particular, and its impact on the growth of the college basketball industry, right? Centered on the labor of its Black athletes, many of them Black Houstonians, but one special one that came from the African continent. And that's what I'm going to read about right now in this beginning, this passage. Slammin' and Jammin' in Houston. In October 1980, a tall and athletic young man from Lagos, Nigeria, arrived in New York City. Unlike the Africans who had arrived on the shores of the United States on ships and in chains centuries before, this young African landed in an airplane at John F. Kennedy Airport in search of a scholarship to play basketball for a major American university. The first stop on his scheduled itinerary was St. John's University in New York City, a school at the forefront of a Northeast college basketball renaissance as part of the newly formed Big East Conference. But as he stepped out of the airport, he immediately took a disliking to the autumn air. He wrote years later, quote, "It was cold. I had never felt cold like that before," unquote. At that moment, he decided that New York was not for him. The next stop on his itinerary was supposed to be Houston, Texas, which he was scheduled to visit 2 days later. But he managed to change his flight and leave the cold of New York later that same day when he arrived from Lagos. Not only would the young man, who was named Hakeem Olajuwon, would go on to change national sports history, meaning the sports history of this country, but he would also become the face of a new Houston, a new transnational Texas. His decision to abandon his plans to visit St. John's in New York and go directly to Houston paralleled the larger population movement to the rapidly growing urban centers of the South and Southwest. The African immigrant was, like many others at the time, Houston bound. And I'm referring to that last quote, Houston bound, to Tawana Steptoe's excellent book, highly recommended, looking at migration of African Americans and Mexican origin peoples in the growth of the music world of Houston, an excellent award-winning book that really influenced my thinking about Texas and Houston in particular. So with that passage, right, I'm trying to kind of situate this legendary basketball player, if you're not a basketball fan, that's okay, in the context of this migration to the Sun Belt. I'm trying to cast Olajuwon's story alongside the legacy of the slave trade, right? And to sort of see how the Black community is being reconfigured in Texas, you know, partly through the immigration of African immigrants to Houston. And some of those, some of the descendants of those migrants, I taught at the University of Texas. There were a number of Nigerian American students at the University of Texas. And so rather than tell the story just of Olajuwon's basketball virtuosity, which I do, you know, I'm trying to kind of set him in this historical context that I think allows us to understand his legacy and the legacy of this moment more fully. So that's where I'll stop, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues. Thank you.
I think we can go on, and the first respondent is Amy Bass.
Thank you so much, Professor Griffin. Thank you, Frank. Thank you for this invitation to join you today. And I'll echo Frank's thanks to Harlow for getting this schedule together. I'm delighted to celebrate the publication of Frank's, what I consider to be epic take on the transformative impact of sport culture in Texas, but of course, America writ large. I was a lucky early reader of this book. I've been with this book for a while. It landed on my desk in September 2019, back in the days when, students stopped by our offices and classes took place in person. I was starting a new job on a new campus, and I was creating curriculum and designing new classes and getting my bearings. And then I got this email from an editor that I knew. Can you take a look at a manuscript for me? And I get a lot of these requests, we all do. But these tend to be pretty narrow requests in that despite the growing popularity of sports scholarship, and it is, and to be at the helm of a sports studies program as I am at Manhattanville is a dream. And the quite obvious headline grabs by athletes who deserve to be listened to, who demand to be listened to. There are still just not enough of us doing this work, meaningful work, significant work on sports. So I began to type my apology for why I could not possibly take on another manuscript to review and look at. But then I saw who the author was. It was Frank. So I typed back yes, and then I was kind of a jerk and I asked a favor and I said, could you print it out and send it to me, please? Because I'm quirky like that and I want to write on the manuscript and I was not in the mood to print this thing out. So the package that arrived was huge. This is a big book, and I think that's important. This is a big book about Texas. And I think that the symbolism there sort of speaks for itself. And so I will say, to have a manuscript of that size sitting on my desk at the beginning of a new semester and a new job was daunting. But it was a Friday. The late afternoon sun was sort of enveloping my office, which made it a place to linger instead of leave. And I picked up the introduction and I thought, I'll take a look, call it a day. Monday's a new week. And 2 hours later, I was still reading. And that's a really good sign. I was hooked on this book about Texas. Frank has a rare combination of talents. It's exceptional writing and exceptional research. His writing flows beautifully. He is a storyteller, as you just saw. His research is deep, but his research is also deeply personal, which is something that is so difficult to do in a significant and meaningful way. He has an incredible attention to detail. And he just mentioned this, the play-by-play, his facility with play-by-play description of sport is so important. His deep dive into athlete biography, understanding that writing about sports is also writing about people. And his ability to contextualize all of that, right? The sign of a brilliant historian, the personal, the biographical, the minutia of gameplay. In this kind of historical framework, it's what makes this so worthy. One of my favorite things that he writes, I'm quoting, lingering on key moments in the performance of sport. It's not just a good thing, it's essential. And indeed, Frank's ability to contextualize these smaller moments into these meaningful big pictures is why this book reads so well, why it reads fast, and why it never feels like sort of the epic tome that it actually is. It is, again, in a word, monumental, and yet it flows like a beach read in many of the places where you're actually turning pages rapidly to find out what happens, even if you already know what happens, which with some of these moments you do. And I kept thinking about where I start when I begin a project, and it's always with C.L.R. James. I always reread Beyond a Boundary. It always starts with James for me, and I kept rephrasing James in my head, paraphrasing him, thinking, what do we know of Texas, who only Texas know? To think about why we need to grasp why Texas is central in our greater appreciation of the significance of the time and space of sport, right? The 60s, the 70s, the dismissive, the so-called slums of decades, in which the athlete, as one famous athlete says, doesn't stay crew cut as the world progresses in this way. So thinking about this razor sharp focus on the 60s and 70s, eras that explode in America's playing fields, and eras in which we need to contextualize sport within these larger political revolutions that are taking on. And so as a history, Frank's work here is comprehensive. College basketball, football, cheerleading, the NFL, pro basketball, pro baseball, women's tennis, and women's tennis, right? We find our revolutions in unlikely places, something Frank said to me just yesterday, and on and on. We examine team ownership, athletes, media coverage, the role of stadiums. And I think that this is the urban space, the idea of urban space and the importance of stadiums as community stakeholders, but also corporate entities is something that is balanced beautifully here in terms of the ideas of entrepreneurship, how these spaces are co-opted by corporate interest, and the wide-ranging impact of commercialism as it wages war with those who still feel this need to believe in some kind of purity of sport, some kind of level playing field of sport. Frank attacks sport from just about every perspective imaginable and seeks to determine how it serves as both a mirror of the society in which it operates, but also as a force of movement, of resistance, of reinforcement, and the tension that exists in these kinds of bipolar spaces, whether we're talking about culture or economy or labor or identity. At the very center of the history that Frank gives us, I think, are the athletes who came of age at a very particular moment in the political and cultural life of the United States, bearing the legacies of Jim Crow segregation and the patriarchies of so-called jock culture, while entangling in Black power, civil rights movements, and an emerging rebirth of feminism. While the history here is sweeping, it is also practical, examining the inner workings of sport as an industry, as a source of entertainment, and as a critical factor in how media developed in the post-World War II era. Example, my jaw pretty much hit the floor as I read about the role of Texas on making football part and parcel of American culture as the marquee sport. How does a state obsession become a national obsession? How does America's so-called national pastime, baseball, get sidelined and downgraded? And all of it taking place well before Buzz Bissinger, sheds light on what goes down in Odessa, Texas, and its beloved Permian Panthers. And then I had some personal moments reading this book. As a girl growing up in the 70s, 80s in New England, why did I play Dallas Cowboy cheerleader at recess? And why did my friend Carrie lie and say her cousin was a Dallas Cowboy cheerleader? And why did we believe her? And why did she fake an autographed photo of that alleged cousin? And we thought that Carrie was that cool because of this tale that she told. And I really hope Carrie's not in the audience, but she's a nurse, so I don't think she is. Frank's book made me understand all of this, outlining both, the technical innovation and the business innovation, and how it created these models of entrepreneurship in Texas sports that made stars out of a handful of athletes and a handful of venues. And make no mistake, the venues are stars unto themselves, with this aura of inclusion that was cloaked in popularity. And so that's really, I think, to wrap it up, the biggest aha moment of this work, the most stunning takeaway, is why Texas is so relevant, beyond relevant in US sports history and in US history writ large. This book really is a case study for next steps in this kind of scholarship, a how-to, if you will, that demonstrates the fruits of diving into sports at every level, from the impossibly local, which is something that I learned with my last book, which was about high school soccer in Maine, something impossibly local, to the regional, to the national, and all through the lens of a state, albeit a state that often considers itself to be, and at one point was, a country unto itself. So I think in this work, the national impact of the Sun Belt is clearly delineated. The rise of cities like San Antonio and Houston, and of course Dallas, on the national landscape as sports powerhouses and everything that goes with it. These are things that are best understood through this lens. And again, a personal example, I teach Billie Jean King and the Battle of the Sexes regularly. I'm teaching it right now, but as part of a broader course on gender and Title IX, a course that's about intersectionality in sports. I hadn't thought of it as Texas history and reframing it in that way. Yes, it is. And what does it mean that it's Texas history? We know what it means through Frank's work and through this book. By the end, Frank brings us almost to a place of dread. We know what comes next in sports, the sort of age of Jordan, Walter Lefever's take on late capitalism. The incredible upsurge, excitement, the dazzle, again, hello cheerleaders, and achievement make way for an era in which sport is a hallmark of late global capitalism, seemingly starved of the innovations and revolutions that precede it. So the athletic revolution was, and kind of is again, and we could talk about Colin Kaepernick and Nike and those kinds of relationships and contracts, is again tied to America's obsession with capitalist endeavor. And I most recently thought about this. It complicates how we need to consider a moment like Renee Montgomery taking an ownership stake in the Atlanta dream. But the way Frank frames this means we are not filled with dread at the end, but rather a greater understanding of how the song can remain the same, that the revolution doesn't need to be turned into uplift, but rather is better served by problematizing every inch of integration, the movement of women, setting it all alongside the development of those fancy skyboxes and those retractable roofs. And this work has done that seamlessly, creating an almost leveling piece of work on both the time period it focuses on and the ones still to come. It's a great book. Congratulations, Frank.
Thank you. Professor Josef Sorett is next.
Thank you, Farah. I'll just echo my colleagues in thanking ISERP, SOF Heyman, and Harlow for bringing us together, to Farah for moderating us and setting up the conversation, and to Frank especially for this deeply researched, gracefully argued, and just beautifully written book. And you know, Amy has set this up so well, and I guess I would just go a step further and to suggest not that anyone would ever want a career other than as a history professor. I think, Frank, you are cut out. You know, ESPN's just down the block still for a second career in color commentary. I mean, it was just such a beautiful book to read. And I have 3 comments, and so my time may be a little brief. And I want to couch them by saying, and maybe this is my role on the panel in a certain way, is that I've never researched sports. I am not a sports scholar in any frame of any suggestion that I might make a claim but I am a fan, and I'm a former athlete. And so I am unequivocally a fan of sports, and even more so now a fan of this book. And so maybe as a tribute to Farah, and maybe as a tribute to Frank, I have 3 comments that all begin with an F today, which was, it's just how things take shape. And the first comes as a former athlete, and but more so as a fan. The second one is maybe a little bit about finances. And the third is one that maybe is perhaps unsurprising as a professor of religion. The third F today will be faith. And we'll get there. And the last 2 at least have questions with them, but in the realm of a fan, I do want to just thank and celebrate the book, which so powerfully brings together a sort of social history and the history of sport with great eloquence and sophistication. And with the title, The Sports Revolution, there are immediately a host of images that come to mind that one could, you know, immediately chart, from Tommy Smith and John Carlos to Kaepernick in the moment, right? That's perhaps the first image when the language of revolution comes to mind. And that story is there, but I also want to commend the multiple registers in which Frank tells a story about a set of entangled and overlapping revolutions. Of course, the racial and gender sexual revolutions of the 1960s, sort of economic revolutions, a rapidly shifting economy and media landscape that makes possible a new set of sports worlds, if you will. And then, of course, how these shifting forces come together to fundamentally change the landscape of sports in the post-civil rights and post-soul era, but also the face of the nation. And for me, in the realm of fan, right, you just provided such a richer and broader context for my earliest memories of what it meant to be a fan. And you tell the sophisticated social history that's there in ways that, right, was just fundamentally, I'm part of the general readership, and that sort of introduction to this history is there. But you also brought to new life, with your ability to carry on the story as a commentator, if you will. I wanted to hear you read the play-by-play. But I can see Earl Campbell running people over and then running down, right? I mean, often because I'm a former athlete, I'm an ultra cranky sports reader, but I never felt that there because I mean, you get it. You tell the story, Frank, in a way. So whether it's re-encountering Earl Campbell or Zena Garrison on the tennis courts, and then just the broader, I mean, of course, Phi Slamma Jamma, as basketball being my primary space of fandom, but giving a whole broader context for the finger roll of George the Iceman Gervin, right? To sort of understand the context of an earlier moment in San Antonio sports history prior to the Duncan and David Robinson era, where there's a particular kind of cleaned and polished up version of, right, San Antonio as the antithesis of what may be happening with Iverson in Philadelphia, or even Jordan, right? This is a different kind of America's team that is implicit in the reading of that San Antonio. Thank you for helping me to go back to those earliest memories and to be able to enjoy them all the while being educated. With regards to the finances, I feel like I should know this, but I just didn't. And I guess this maybe speaks to the points about the need for this scholarship that Amy was mentioning, is from the ups and downs of the oil and tobacco industries to the range of business backgrounds that provide owners with the capital to stake a claim in professional sports, but also to provide opportunities and platforms for a new generation of athletes under the sign of integration, whether those athletes be Black and white or all hues between. And to do that, it would seem together, right, with an appeal to inclusion, but being inscribed in a new set of narratives that are not solely unlimited opportunities, even if access to capital is part of the story. The question I want to ask is sort of, I mean, I think it's in this, especially as it relates to the question of the economy, the sort of historian's question of change over time, right? That you tell just, I mean, it just makes such perfect sense as you narrate it. And I think at the end of the book, where you sort of sum up some of the shifts between the early entrepreneurial spirit and social change, ... that leads towards commodification and profiteering, right? There's a moment for a sec where, well, is this a narrative of decline? Is this a critique of when sports hits late capital from an earlier moment? Right, and I would love to hear you say a little more as we're sort of thinking about sort of questions around race and wealth and labor that are front and center in sports, whether at the college or collegiate level. This could, right, be another way of thinking about a history of Black capitalism, and the way in which even your question around labor at the outset, or thinking about the sort of economic opportunities for coaches and for quarterbacks and for owners, the sort of discourse around when it is a Black person, right, that is right, when Black is the adjective in front of quarterback, coaches, and owners. So I'd love to hear, like, what does it mean to think about this in a moment now where, right, alongside Kaepernick signing a contract alongside his own protest, where LeBron is signing a lifetime billion-dollar deal, and right, to think about those two things. And then finally, I know this is not the story you're telling, and I know there was an event in which you were going to be thinking about religion and faith that did not happen because of a different set of questions around labor. But I would love to hear your thoughts that is maybe not the foregrounded story, which is about where is faith, right? Where is, whatever the rubric is, right? You have that powerful part where you talk about a gift from, right, the Yoruba gods that to Guy Lewis in the form of Akeem the Dream Olajuwon. But I was also thinking about Tom Landry, right, who became the cover of evangelical comic books in the 1980s, right? He was a sort of hero within those spaces. You make mention, of course, of the narrative around Texas Stadium with the opening in the roof so that God can watch, right, his favorite team play. But then even in shifting between Dallas and Houston, right? Dallas, not only at the home of the Cowboys, but also the epicenter for televangelism, right? This is the home of Trinity Broadcasting Network. And then Houston, right? And this is where, I mean, maybe there's a stadium story here, right? The arena in which the Houston Rockets play for just 5 years is now the home to, right, Lakewood Church, which we all are familiar with when we don't turn the channel after, right, Meet the Press on Sunday mornings to Joel Osteen, which of course is, right, this bright and shiny image of multicultural Christianity, right? As we, so I wonder for you, where is the faith in this story? Where are the churches? You mentioned them in passing, but I'd love to hear more. All right, thank you, Frank. That's my real point. It just was such a pleasure to read. And thank you for the invitation to talk about it today with everyone else on the panel.
Thank you, Josef. Like organizing things around the letter F. We appreciate that. Yeah. I'm going to turn to Samuel Freeman.
Thank you. First of all, Frank, thank you for a splendid book, which was edifying and completely enjoyable to read. So I appreciate that, first of all, and thank you, Farah and Harlow, for including me in this and for making this particular event run so seamlessly. I'll try to do nothing to tear up the stitches from it now. There are so many wonderful anecdotes in this book, all in the service of a much bigger vision. But let me just start with one. Frank describes a group of working class Mexican-American fans of the San Antonio Spurs in their early days in the American Basketball Association, the Renegade League, if some of you don't know it, that was set up to challenge the established NBA. And they would get 10-cent cans of beer and taunt the other team's players and coaches. And they particularly had an animus towards Larry Brown, who was then the coach of the Denver Nuggets. And Frank describes, after they'd read some interview in which Larry Brown made a reference to guacamole salad, like right there, what? Anyway, that set them off. And so the next time the Nuggets came to San Antonio to play, the baseline bums were throwing batches of guacamole and whole avocados at Brown to show their disdain for him. So I just want to say that no one will ever throw guacamole or whole avocados at this book or at its author. It's entirely achieved and deserves only whatever the culinary opposite of that would be. And I come to it from a couple of perspectives. In the books I've written, a number of them have dealt with social justice topics, with race, with immigration. One of them in particular that Farah was kind enough to mention, Breaking the Line, was about the role of HBCU football, particularly in the late 1960s, in contributing to the freedom movement. So I have some thoughts about content to bring to bear, but also want to start with some thoughts about form and the challenges of form. Because for many years now at Columbia, actually, this is the 31st year, I've taught a seminar in writing nonfiction books, and a number of books have come out of that class. And besides my own work, teaching that class compels me to think constantly about how to configure books, how to organize them, how to execute them. And I think one of the great achievements of this book is to avoid what could have been the snare of its conception, which is to say, a book that takes geography as one of its primary organizing principles and takes what's in many ways a national phenomenon, which is the sports revolution, and even the role in terms of race and gender and sexual orientation of using sports to push against retrograde orthodoxies. In many ways, that's a national story. And it's expedient both to cut it down to size, but also for being published by University of Texas Press and have taught at UT Austin, to draw literally the barrier around Texas, which, as capacious as it is still a single state. So I think the question I had reading it, which was more than settled, all of my concerns were completely assuaged, is can this book be more than a compendium of all the set pieces, anecdotes, and observations bearing on the sports revolution that just happened to take place in Texas? And could this book not have been written just as readily about Florida or about California or maybe about Michigan, other sports obsessed states that had their own part to play in this revolution? And I think the greatest overarching achievement of the book is in a completely unforced, persuasive way to show that Texas really did have this wildly disproportionate role in pushing the barriers around race, gender, sexual orientation as well. And I think part of the reason Frank is able to make that argument stick is that he's such a supple and subtle and nuanced thinker about the mixed motives that go into making social change. There were times reading this book, although it's much bigger in scope, but when, in one respect, it put me in mind of a favorite book of mine on this subject called The Real Pepsi Challenge. And it was a book about how Pepsi began to market to Black consumers and began to hire Black sales reps, not because they were so enlightened, but because they saw a business opportunity, because Coca-Cola at that time was so associated with the Jim Crow South and with ignoring any direct marketing to Black Americans, that Pepsi saw an opportunity. But the commercial incentive then led Pepsi to inevitably become more entwined with Black American life and with the upward mobility that was achieved by the sales reps, some of whom became higher level execs over time. And I was thinking about Frank's keen assessment of similarly mixed motives in the world of sports, whether it was the fact that the breakthrough in women's tennis is being funded by Philip Morris, a cigarette company, long after we know the health risks of tobacco. And by the way, at a personal level, that rang so true to me because in the 1980s, when I was covering the theater industry for the New York Times, not as a critic, but as a reporter, so it's very much of a business beat, Philip Morris was a huge funder of arts programming in New York. And so I remember going to luncheons in their corporate suite where their main program officer would bring in great playwrights and directors, and people were so eager for the funding, even knowing where it was coming from. So anyway, the real clear eye towards the mixed motives of the people involved in funding and, really propagating women's tennis. The role of individual coaches who, some of them had deep feelings, and I'm talking about the white coaches who decided to desegregate their teams, some of whom had idealism woven into their lives early on, others of whom purely wanted to be expedient competitors. And if the elite schools of the Southwest Conference, as Frank writes, Texas, Arkansas particularly, were not going to recruit African-American players, then upstart programs like SMU were going to do it. But sometimes that meant that the coaches who came in, not so much Hayden Fry, but later Ron Meyer, who recruits Eric Dickerson, were roguish figures themselves and left a trail of corruption that lasted long after they'd made their escape to coach in the NFL. So again, the real mix of motivations here. In the talking about woke capitalism these days, we're sometimes stuck on this idea that motives may only be pure. Motives are almost always mixed, and a lot of social change is made by flawed people for flawed reasons. And Frank is very astute to that. And similarly, last point that goes to this, in writing about the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders, the complexity, and I mean that as the highest praise, of these women who are being sexualized, who in this super contradictory way were being made into both the virgin and the whore simultaneously, and yet who also in their female leadership were genuinely athletes, were genuinely dance artists, and who were struggling to defy the limits in which they were placed. And what Frank anticipates in writing about them is the era we're in more recently, in which cheer is now an NCAA sport with its own championships. And we understand how tremendously demanding physically the sport is. When Frank talks about the training regimen of the cheerleaders, it's extraordinary and it's outrageous because they're paid virtually nothing for doing it. As a second thing that really I want to compliment on is, because I'm a journalism professor as well as a longtime journalist, is again more of the wonderful complexity in the role journalists played. I think Frank really catches an inflection moment in sports journalism when it's going from this cheerleading, root for the home team, want to be friendly with the coach and the star player mentality, to a different generation of journalists who see their role as being more critical of big capital, of being more on the side of social change. And you could just draw the line through the portraits in this book, where on the one hand, you have groundbreaking African-American journalists like Lloyd Wells, who are very explicitly playing a role through their journalism, advocating for the freedom movement. And you have enlightened white journalists like Skip Bayless. I'm not going to address anything of the persona he plays on ESPN or on Fox now. It actually grieves me knowing how excellent a lot of his written work earlier in his career was. But you have people like Wells and Bayless on the one hand, and then you have Curry Kirkpatrick, who's a much celebrated Sports Illustrated writer, trafficking in the most tawdry kind of anti-Latinx stereotypes. Chet Forte, acclaimed for a lot of the camera work he did in Monday Night Football and Wild World of Sports, but pioneering this leering shot of cheerleaders called the so-called honey shot, more of the sexualization of women around the game. And even the kind of jagged line that runs through the individual person of Howard Cosell, who would be alternatively, I think a lot of us know the positive side of him in his role advocating for Muhammad Ali, but when it came to broadcasting the Battle of the Sexes and the way he dealt with Billie Jean King, he was a complete sexist throwback and almost delighting in that role. So Frank really gets this pivotal moment in journalism. And one of the last things I'll say, and I'll leave him a couple of questions for the Q&A part, is he's also very brilliant in the way novelists are in looking at the personal toll being a groundbreaker was. He writes with great moving intricacy about Jerry Levias, who was the first African-American player recruited for SMU. And even though we've heard versions of this story before with players like Jackie Robinson in pro baseball, Levias having to deal with threats, with racism, with taunting, to be brilliant and unflappable on the gridiron and never able to express what he was feeling or going through, and kind of the long-term toll that it took on him. He talks at one point in the book of how it took decades for him to begin to unpack the emotions of that time. And I think similarly, we get some of that with the portraits of Billie Jean King. And even though she's not a Texan, nor was King, Rosie Casals, who's a working class Hispanic young woman who starts playing tennis on the public courts in San Francisco, and also has to deal with being in the middle of trying to be taken seriously as a player while being constantly condescended to and underpaid. So all that just brings such a welcome human element to it. I'm sorry, I've probably overrun my time, but please take that as a compliment to this great book. And probably the last thing I would dare to do, I'm sure Frank's editor would kill me for asking why a few other things weren't included, but since we're all just blue skying here with our questions, a couple of the important social change narratives happened out in El Paso. Texas Western University was the first all-Black team to win the NCAA basketball tournament, and did it beating the notoriously always all-white Kentucky team of Adolph Rupp in 1966. And it's mentioned, but there's not much said of it. And also somewhat lesser known, but when Texas Western then was retitled UTEP, University of Texas, El Paso, in the early 70s, they had a perennial NCAA championship cross-country team, which, because it had a number of African immigrant athletes on it, became a target for racists and nativists at that time. So I'm just curious, I know that Frank must know these narratives in and out and sideways, but what the decision-making was to include or not include those particular portions of the book. But Frank, overall, I just have the highest praise for this book, and I hope that it will be extremely widely read and enthusiastically reviewed. And as Dr. Bass said, that it should cross over in readerships from the most serious scholars to, interested fans as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for those rich comments. Frank, you have a lot to think about, respond to. I'm going to ask that you take about 5 minutes to respond, and then we'll open up to Q&A, which will also be a chance to get in a little more deeply.
Yes, I'm overwhelmed by the generosity of the comments, and I was processing stuff beforehand. Now I have to process this, but this is a good thing to process. So, one of the things that occurred to me, particularly when, all the comments, but certainly in Amy's comments about late capitalism, and then of course in Josef talking about financing, is this, this question of capitalism, which I didn't foresee dealing with when I started this book, right? But it became pretty quickly. I figured pretty quickly I'd have to deal with it pretty quickly, right? Because I had to understand why Texas, okay? And this also goes to the point that Sam raised, right? You know, the 60s and 70s, you know, this is a US historiographical observation, you know, it's told, you know, in terms of urban history as a history of urban decline, whether it's the New York City financial crisis, the Bronx is burning, the deindustrialization of the Rust Belt, right? The transformation that we often we talk about that period, but that's not what's going on in Texas. Texas, essentially, from an economic standpoint, is on this perpetual upward trajectory until the 1980s, right? So the political economy of Texas, right, weighed very heavily in my thinking about why focus on that place, right? And not just because it's big and they think they're important. So, you know, so that helps explain the power of the sports entrepreneurs who are these sons of oilmen who decide that they're going to intrude upon the professional sports industry. You know, it's not like they were welcome with open arms, Lamar Hunt and Bud Adams and all these folks that I talk about here, right? So part of the story here is understanding how the Sun Belt, and this is something that other historians have talked about, becomes, you know, really important. We look at the second half of the 20th century, right? And so if we're going to understand, you know, the sports revolution as a national phenomenon, and it certainly is, and I think California, you know, you can make a compelling case for California, but I understand the dramatic social change in Texas, right, which is completely steeped in a Jim Crow environment. It seemed to be a case that was, you know, that really invited a particular kind of analysis, right, that allows us to understand, you know, how a society steeped in these hierarchies transforms to some degree, right? And I think there is a transformation happening there in that period. And I think also it invites us to really think about, you know, with respect to race and ethnicity in a nuanced way. So that to talk about these transformations, you have to talk about Mexican Americans, you have to talk about Latinx populations, right? And so, you know, certainly you're seeing a similar dynamic in other parts of the South, certainly in Georgia and Louisiana. But, you know, some of these things are happening even in the early post-World War II period when the Cotton Bowl New Year's Day Classic becomes desegregated, right, in the late 1940s. Again, because the entrepreneurs figure out that we're either going to, you know, kind of invest in sports as a civic enterprise, as a business enterprise. And if we're going to do that, we're going to have to let go of some aspects of Jim Crow segregation, right? That's an interesting dynamic that happens all over the South, but it's happening in Texas first, I think, because of the engine of the economy. That's sort of the argument I make in the book. And so, but I'm also, I guess, joining the work on new histories of capitalism, which again, I didn't see myself doing, right? In that I'm trying to historicize this process, right? I'm trying to get us to think about, you know, we celebrate, certainly in the sports world, you know, the whole notion of sport being an equal playing field, that sport somehow has a particular sensibility with respect to racism or racial integration in particular. But again, that's a story that's linked to these economic transformations, right? And other folks have shown this, but I think when you see it happening in a Jim Crow environment, then you really can appreciate that shift in that period, right? So this becomes a book about, you know, capitalism and the sports business, sports industry in flux. And that's what enables these transformations, right? This is not people coming out of, you know, MBA programs like Columbia University Sports Management Program to make money in sport. That's what happens now. You have a much more codified situation starting in the 1980s and moving up into the present than what you see happening in the late 1960s. So marginalized people are able to capitalize in that moment, right? And so that explains to me, helps me understand, you know, the relation between capitalism and social change, right? And then in the end, this is an alliance, right? I think that's also the story of the Black freedom movement in general. Black freedom movement is a history of social movement transformation and triumph, but it's a history of alliances with non-Black folks, right? And I think that, you know, we're sort of seeing this dynamic now with the movement for Black lives in sports, like, and seeing the kind of thing that, you know, we're alluding to as woke capitalism now. You know, it's so interesting to see this development happening just in the last year. The relation between the Black freedom movement and the ways that corporate interests responded are analogous to what I saw happening in the 60s and the 70s, right? And other historians have talked about this in other dimensions, but I felt like I hadn't seen it so clearly with respect to sports, you know. I want to say something about faith, but, you know, I guess I'll, you know, because I'm almost over 5 minutes, maybe I can come back to that later, because I think that's such an astute observation.
Why don't you go on, because we're still gathering. I'm going to invite the audience to please write your questions in the Q&A. And until that happens, you can take the time you need.
Okay. All right, good. I love the 3 Fs, Josef. I wanted to ask you about religion, so I'm glad you did. You know, you could probably write a book, maybe somebody has done it already, about the religious revolution in this period, you know, and the growth of, and I see this, you know, alongside the sport one. And even your comments about the growth of the mega churches and the televangelism, right? And the ways in which, churches are moving into athletic spaces a little bit later, right? Like the old Summit building in Houston. And there's many examples of that. The old Forum was a church space in Los Angeles after the Lakers left that arena in the 1990s. But there's no question that there is a religious dimension to the story, right? And some of it shows up in the self-identifications of some of these white coaches. So Bill Yeoman, who's the head football coach of the University of Houston Cougars, when people are trying to ask him, why did you decide to integrate your football program in the mid-1960s? He just says point blank, I wasn't a pioneer, I'm paraphrasing, it's just about my relationship with the Lord, right? And he's, kind of speaking to this pervasiveness of, that you see very clearly in the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which is a topic that is a book waiting to be written, by the way, right? The ways in which evangelical Christianity in that period is not as tethered to right-wing politics as it becomes later on after the Reagan era, right? So it doesn't surprise me that, some of these coaches are kind of anchoring in their sensitivity or their attitudes towards integration around religion, right? Because the alliances that we see very clearly now, that's something that really takes shape afterwards. Then there's the whole notion of, even the role of faith in Black athletic culture, right? I think that's something that's very much part of the Southern Black experience in terms of sports. I mean, we see this all the time in terms of performances of religiosity on the playing field, but that certainly figures very prominently in the kind of the Black sporting culture that I link to Black churches, but I think there's a lot of overlap there. I also want to say that those integration pioneers, like Jerry Levias and some of these other folks who become the first Black player, or the first woman player, the first whatever, they took a leap of faith, because in retrospect, you might say to yourself, gee, of course they would sign with a predominantly white school or sign with a professional franchise. It's a no-brainer, but it wasn't a no-brainer, right? And when you learn about their experiences, you see why that they had to take an enormous leap of faith to trust white sporting institutions with their athletic labor, right? And sometimes that trust was warranted, and a lot of times it was not, and it was exploited. And that's what we see more often today, as far as I'm concerned, right? And so, I love the notion of faith running through this story, because there are a lot of people acting on faith, right? This is a moment when things are shifting very rapidly. And some of that faith is religiously inspired, and some of it is just taking a risk. And that's a lot of the story, I think, of this book are entrepreneurs, activists, and athletes, taking leaps of faith. That's my thinking about faith in this book.
Yes. We have two questions, both very interesting, so I hope we can get to both of them. The first one, this book has such a broad expanse, and yet I imagine there are stories you were not able to tell, like Sam suggests. Can you talk a little bit about something that didn't make it into the book that also conveys Texas's role in the sports revolution?
Oh, what didn't make it in this book? It's actually, it's a state history, but writing a history of sport in Texas is an immense undertaking. And I started this book before I came to Columbia. I started it when I thought it was going to be an easy book to write, because I had no intention of leaving Texas at the time. Then the gods intervened in my life and brought me here to New York City. And so then I had to write the book in a different way. I had a much more grassroots thinking about this book. I wanted to write about kind of soccer grassroots culture. I wanted to write about, obviously, high school sports, which people talk about all the time with respect to Texas. I wanted to speak about HBCUs, which I'm surprised Sam didn't raise, right? I mean, one of the things that is not in this book at all are the ways in which HBCUs lost out in the sports revolution, right? And that's a story we know already in different ways, but the Prairie Viewers and the Texas Southerns and those Black schools that had been the primary space of Black athletic culture, they still are in this, but they don't disappear. But that story hasn't been written. It has been written with respect to like books like Sam's, books on Grambling college football, the Grambling University program. But there's much more to say about HBCUs in this period. Derek White's excellent book on Florida A&M gives us a sense of this. So, there's a whole, the Black women in track and field, something I wanted to talk about, didn't talk about that either. And I didn't, every time I have a book event, I always get asked about El Paso and Texas Western. And part of the reason why I didn't tell the story of Texas Western, University of Texas El Paso, because it kind of had been told already. And I wasn't sure what more I could add to that story, although I think it just exemplifies the point that I'm making in this book all along. You can't understand integration of college basketball without understanding what happened with Texas Western in the late 50s, early 60s, right? Before the University of Houston, right? But then also I was committed to telling certain stories. This could have been a book very easily about one sport, right? It could have been about the Black athlete. And that would have been fine and it would have made an impact, but I was kind of committed to telling different stories of different parts of the state I really wanted to have a more inclusive gender conception in this book than, I think a lot of sports histories do have, So as a result, the Texas Western story fell out of the equation. But it deserves to be there. It's definitely part of the story. Absolutely. Yeah, there were a lot of things I couldn't write about. It's because the state has a rich sports history, and I think if we're going to talk about youth sports, grassroots sports, that's another story to tell. I mean, this story very much stays at the level of the big time programs of collegiate and sports, professional sports franchises.
So the next question. Wondering about the arc of professional cheerleading from the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders to the present canceling of the program by the Washington football team because of scandals that have been revealed and are probably emblematic of all pro cheerleading programs. Ultimately, positive for women, negative for women.
Well, okay, so I could give you the short answer is negative for women, but I think that's not an entirely accurate assessment. At least I wouldn't give that assessment, right? Because the exploitative dimensions of the cheerleading industry are clear. Right. And that's a theme that I talk about in this book over and over again. Right. The ways in which the Dallas Cowboys NFL franchise, right, and then subsequently other NFL franchises are running a kind of labor structure that's a gendered labor structure. Right. It's not just the male football players on the field. It are the dancers on the sidelines. Right. The football players on the field are not getting paid that much in that period. This is before free agency in professional football. So they're certainly exploited by the Cowboys. Absolutely. The Cowboys really pioneer sports management as this professional enterprise that we know today. That's just a much more bigger, enterprise that we see even with the Cowboys in that era. And whereas the women are getting paid less, much less, right, than the men, right? And yet they're doing as taxing labor as the football players on the field. So the exploitative dimension, which you could run right up to the present, which has been shown over and over again with all the lawsuits we see of cheerleaders filing against the NFL, right? So that's a through line that's still there. And yet, this is a practice that predates Title IX. This is a practice that athletically inclined women were part of before the expansion of the women's sports industry in the 1970s and 80s, right? So to simply regarded as a space of exploitation and objectification, really doesn't allow us to see the skill sets that these dancers have. And not just women. Now, as you see in the Netflix show, this is a very important space for queer folks. This is a very important space for non-normative gender folks. Absolutely, right? I mean, that cheer show shows that very clearly, right? So in the NFL level, the question of pay equity and pushing back against sexual harassment and assault are the major questions there, right? But beyond that, it remains an important space for athletically inclined folks. But it is exploitative, absolutely, no doubt. But for marginalized folks, it's become critical, right? Many of these women who are dancing for the Cowboys are these upwardly mobile, working class women looking to make it some way, shape, or form, and that's very much part of the story too.
Okay, doesn't look like there are any more questions. Does anyone on our panel have final thoughts you want to share, or Frank, final thoughts you want to share?
I just have to say one more thing, because I'm on a panel with you, Farah, so I have to say this if I could. I haven't talked about Black studies interventions, but I have an eye towards Black studies interventions with this book, right? I think Black studies scholars can write about a Hakeem Olajuwon and a George Gervin in the ways in which Farah Jasmine Griffin writes about Billie Holiday, in the ways in which Deborah Paredes writes about divas, right? There is a many established traditions in Black studies of jazz writing, of writing about Black performance, right? But we don't have it in sports in the same way. We have journalists writing about sports in very eloquent ways. And in fact, much of that play-by-play analysis is informed by sports journalism, but also by performance studies. I'm connected to a very important performance studies scholar in my own household, so that's part of it. But I want us to think about how we can write about Black athletic virtuosity. Because I haven't seen it. I see it here and there with Muhammad Ali and little things like that. But like when we think about Serena Williams, when we think about a Simone Biles, when we think about some of these folks that I write about, among others, they are sources of storytelling and theoretical inspiration, I think, in terms of embodied practice. So, I feel like I have to say that as a call for our field to take these figures seriously. And so we can talk about Black athletes certainly as objects of exploitation by the capitalist machine, as we should, or as, you know, people making a lot of money. Although the people who pay LeBron James are making more money than he does, right? The billionaires have more money than the millionaires. But I think as a Black studies exercise, there's just a lot of work to do, you know, to write about people in the past, the way we write about John Coltrane, the way we write about Miles Davis, the way we write about, you know, Billie Holiday, you know. And so I feel like I have to say that, because I think that's an opening for folks to take up. People have done it, but there's much more to do as far as I'm concerned. So I just felt like I had to say that, take advantage of saying that while we're in the virtual room together.
Thank you for saying it. I mean, as I was reading your book, I was thinking the same thing. And I was thinking only, you know, Michael Jordan has generated that kind of thinking and theorizing. But, it's, you know, you kind of lay it out as an invitation and a model. So thank you. Thank you all of our speakers. Thank you to our audience for joining us. Buy this book. And it is, I think it is going to be a crossover, you know, academics, students, but also people who are just interested in the subjects that it touches upon, because it's so beautifully written, so accessibly written. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you all. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you.